This is a review of Chapter 3 and highlights some of the author's ideas. The chapter is called And the Poor Get Prison. The first area is weeding out the wealthy, and the authors contend that the criminal justice system works differently for the rich versus the poor. And so that when we see the face of those that go through the system, they are more likely to represent poor people. And a lot of people state that, well, the poor people commit more crime. But a study in 2007 found that there was more police surveillance, so you were more likely to come in contact with the police and then be arrested if you were poor. Also, there's been several studies that show that when we compare crimes, the seriousness of crimes and prior record, black juveniles tend to commit less crime or admit to less crime than white juveniles, yet are more likely to be placed in detention. This is called a cumulative disadvantage. In other words, the criminal justice system is biased based on lack of money. So arrest decisions, where are the police patrolling, what crimes do we concentrate on, bail decisions as far as the amount and who can afford the amount, prosecution decisions, really based on, do you have a good attorney? Does the prosecutor think you're dangerous? And then ultimately sentencing decisions that afford those with more money lesser sentences. A lot of times probation versus prison. Interestingly, the FBI doesn't collect any data on income when it does its arrest data. Now, it does collect on race, but it would be very interesting to see, just in some studies, how many people that ultimately are arrested and then go to jail and can't afford bond, what their income level is. Thus, the authors contend there's differential treatment based not only on race, but also on poverty. One of the reasons Black and Hispanics are more likely to be poor, and this is based on lack of business ownership and higher unemployment, to get a bigger picture of the poverty level. Also, the neighborhood and your exposure to illicit activities, including drugs, is important. If you live in a stable residential neighborhood, people might be doing crimes, but they're not doing them out in the open, and you might not be exposed to them. But when we go to violent inner city neighborhoods or unstable city neighborhoods, a lot of times the illicit drug activity, the illicit crimes are out in the open, so that kids early on are exposed to them. Thus, we find that those that end up in jail and prison really kind of reflect the lower class, whether or not they're white, black, or Hispanic. And so the authors contend that this economic and racial bias is really embedded into criminal justice policies and procedures. So just looking at crime, the poor commit burglary, robbery, assault, etc., what we would call street crimes, but they don't have access to commit other crimes like antitrust violations, embezzlement, work safety violations, tax evasion, etc. The authors point out that the cost of white-collar crime is many times much higher than when we add up all the street crime. It still causes financial loss, it causes psychological harm, and it erodes the public confidence. And this reflects how we feel about street crime. And so in a recent study, they said that white-collar crimes exceed $1.6 trillion in victim costs. And yet, we look at the criminal justice system, and it still is primarily focused on crimes committed by the poor. So the authors then go through the different processes, starting with arrest and charging. One, the poor, because they're more out in the open, they're more unstable neighborhoods, come to the attention of the police. And once you get the attention of the police, you're more likely to be charged. That is in comparison to when people have contact with the police from middle or upper class. Of those that have equal similar circumstances and prior records, the poor receive harsher sentences. So blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be detained than whites. And one example is the war on drugs. You've probably studied the disparity based on the drugs used. Crack has a stiffer sentence than cocaine, even though they're both the same drug. But crack is used by poor people and cocaine is used by rich people. There's disparity based on economics. If you can't make bail, if you can't afford an attorney, you can't hire people to look into your case. And then there's a disparity based on race. That even when we look at people with similar circumstances, particularly juveniles, that what the system looks at as determining factors of dangerousness, many times benefit the white defendant. So here's an example. You have two parents versus a single parent, which is weighed as being more unstable. It usually is the single parent. Even though both parents, when you have a mom and a dad, they could both be alcoholics. But we have a bias that single parenthood can't supervise their child as well as a two-parent household. Another thing that the chapter points out is there's a little different pathway for the arrest and charging of white collar or corporate crime. And the one study shows that out of the 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies had been charged for law violations. Yet we never see or rarely see executives being held accountable for those violations. One of the things that happens is regulatory agencies are not given the same tools or resources to fight these more sophisticated crimes. We know that identity theft is huge, and syndicates are doing identity thefts. In Big Rapids, a few years ago, Buffalo Wild Wings had everybody's credit card numbers stolen. And I can remember one Ferris student whose identity was stolen. The people that had her ID bought a house, bought cars, despite the fact that she really didn't have a credit rating, which shows that the sophistication of putting together bits and pieces of people's information. Further, many state agencies, and Michigan is named as one, lack the authority to initiate activities. So really, until something happens, no one's watching over businesses or corporations to make sure that they follow the law. Finally, and we can see this happening all the time, there is a belief that the government is bad right now. And so when they make cuts, and that is through tax cuts, they cut these overseeing agencies, not only in personnel and budget, it keeps the investigation to a minimum. So just think about right now, like for example, the Environmental Protection Agency. Who's in charge and what are they looking at? The Food and Drug Administration. Who's in charge and what are they looking at? When we look at adjudication and conviction of street crime, I put this little table up there. If you're black, you're more likely to be convicted. Latino comes next, and then if you're white, you're third. So the poor defendant is more likely to be convicted than the rich defendant. 75% of those with minor offenses can't make bond. I do want to qualify that we're starting to see some movement in states that are looking at these lower level crimes and releasing offenders because of the disparity of people that don't have money and are being held in jail. So let's say you have public intoxication and the bail is $1,000, which you would need 10% or $100. If you don't have $100 and no one you know has $100, then you're sitting in there until you go to court. 95% of convictions come from plea bargaining. And although we are guaranteed representation, if you have no money, you have to rely on the representation given to you. And the Supreme Court has set the standards for what is considered ineffective counsel so low that you could be sleeping, you could be drunk, you could be the worst lawyer in the world, and that will meet the standard. I skipped one, and one of the things that we find is that those that don't make bail are more likely to be convicted and more likely to get more time, despite the fact that they have time served. Finally, the real thing is, if you can pay for your lawyer is going to work harder for you. They can pay experts that might help your case. And then if you get out on bond, you can help and assist in your case. Finally, we look at sentencing, and we find, in comparison to even middle class, harshest penalties go for the lower class. And then we treat the higher class with kid gloves on, and more likely they are weeded out, or they get minor time. So the book talks about the dorm room dealers, where they were dealing thousands of dollars in drugs, and yet they ended up getting probation. If you had somebody in a lower class neighborhood dealing thousands of dollars in drugs, I can guarantee you they will not get probation. Finally, some of the other things that we notice from the research is if you're unemployed versus employed, you're more likely to get time. If you come from an unstable neighborhood, lower class neighborhood versus a middle class or upper class neighborhood, you're more likely to get time. And ultimately, street crime versus white collar crime gets all the attention. Most police departments do not have a white collar crime unit. And when we rely on state agencies and federal agencies, they've been crippled so much that they're not very effective in preempting white collar crime. Ultimately, even studies looking at the death penalty, racial minorities, poor racial minorities are more likely to get the death penalty. So the rest of the chapter, and when you read through it, gives example after example of white collar crimes that physically and financially and psychologically harmed people for millions of dollars, and yet they are treated by the criminal justice system very differently, and most of the time that the results are just a slap on the wrist.